Before you dive into this gripping tale, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know your initial thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world. The scent of betrayal hit Evelyn Hayes before the sight of it. A cloying mix of expensive perfume and her husband's familiar cologne, clinging to the air like a shroud. She stood frozen outside the polished mahogany doors of Alexander Thorne's executive suite, a carefully packed lunchbox, the one he always said reminded him of home, now feeling like a lead weight in her trembling hands. She hadn't planned on stopping by his office today. It had been a long night. The twins, nestled deep within her, had been restless, their tiny kicks a constant reminder of the new life she carried. Her back ached, a dull throb that had been a constant companion these past few months. But a strange, insistent pull had brought her here, to Thorne Industries, the towering glass monolith that housed her husband's empire. She'd just come from her latest scan, seeing them again. Two perfect boys. They were healthy, strong, and clearly determined to push her emotional and physical limits. A soft smile touched her lips. She couldn't wait to tell Alexander in person. He'd been distant lately, preoccupied, but she'd attributed it to the relentless pressure of running a global conglomerate. He was a CEO, after all, bearing the weight of thousands on his shoulders. That's why she'd chosen to surprise him today, unannounced, with lunch and good news, a gentle reminder that some things were bigger than power and stress. Like family, the receptionist, a young woman named Chloe, greeted her by name, smiling, waving her past to the private elevator. Evelyn knew the way by heart. The top floor, far from the daily chaos, where Alexander kept his impeccable private office. As the elevator doors glided open, her heels echoed softly on the marble. Laughter drifted from behind the double doors ahead. His laughter, deep, familiar, but not alone. Female voices. Two of them. Evelyn hesitated, her hand hovering over the ornate handle. Don't assume the worst, she told herself. Perhaps it's a meeting. Perhaps his assistant has company. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart still calm, her breath steady. But what she saw inside stole the air from her lungs, a brutal punch to the chest. Alexander sat sprawled on his office sofa, jacket discarded, a drink in hand. Beside him, two women. One's hand rested intimately on his arm, the other laughing a little too close. He didn't see her at first, too engrossed in their flirtation, their proximity, the unspoken intimacy that had no place in the life he'd promised Evelyn. When his gaze finally drifted to her, it was slow, casual, as if expecting another assistant or employee. Then he saw her, the lunchbox in her hand, the swollen curve of her abdomen, her eyes. For one horrifying second, no one spoke. Evelyn didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't throw the food, or demand answers. She simply looked at him, held his gaze for one long, burning moment. Then she turned and walked out, past the stunned women, past the silent corridor, past the smiling receptionist who said, "Have a lovely day," without looking up. She stepped out into the crisp London autumn air. The city rushed around her, oblivious, as if her world hadn't just shattered. She walked 5 blocks before she even realized where she was going. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably him. But she didn't check it. She just kept walking. She knew now everything had changed. No conversation could fix what she'd just seen. No excuse or apology could mend it. She had come to tell him she carried his children. Instead, she walked away with them still hidden inside her. 3 hearts now beating in silent defiance. What would you have done in Evelyn's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. And so, Evelyn Hayes vanished. The train journey out of London was long, gray, and strangely comforting. Evelyn sat by the window, one hand resting protectively on her belly, the other clutching a small paper coffee cup she had no intention of drinking. She watched as buildings blurred into smaller towns, the skyline giving way to quiet trees and winding country roads until the city that had built their relationship and then destroyed it was gone. She hadn't packed much, only what she could carry, because she hadn't planned on leaving. But after what she saw in Alexander's office, there was no turning back. Her mind had been made up the moment the elevator doors closed behind her. Her heart had broken in silence, and yet all she could think of now was survival. Not revenge, not confrontation, just protection. For herself, for the babies, for the life she needed to rebuild far from him. She told no one where she was going, not her sister, not her university friends, not even her landlord. She didn't use her bank cards, paying for everything in cash. It felt dramatic, like something out of a film. But the truth was, she didn't trust Alexander not to come after her. Not because he loved her, but because his pride might compel him to fix what he'd broken, for appearance's sake. Evelyn wasn't interested in being saved. She was interested in never being betrayed again. She found a small rental cottage, 2 counties away, just outside a sleepy coastal town in Cornwall. The place was old, with creaky floors and a dripping tap, but it was quiet. There was a pine tree in the front yard, and gulls called to each other in the morning. It was nothing like the penthouse she'd once shared with Alexander. But here, she could breathe, truly breathe. She contacted a local obstetrician who asked no questions about why she'd moved mid-pregnancy. She found a second-hand cot on Facebook Marketplace and assembled it herself, wobbly piece by wobbly piece, as the twins gently kicked inside her. She didn't cry during those long nights, not because she wasn't broken, but because she didn't want her babies to feel her sadness. She told them stories as she lay on her back, hands on her stomach, imagining what their faces would look like. She knew they would resemble him. It was inevitable. And she also knew that even if it hurt to see him in them, she would love them harder than she had loved anyone. The day she went into labor came sooner than expected. She was 36 weeks when the contractions started, sudden and sharp. There was no one to call, no one to drive her. She took a taxi to the local hospital, gripping the armrest with each wave of pain, barely making it through the entrance before collapsing into a wheelchair. The labor was long, intense, and filled with moments where she thought she might pass out entirely. But when the nurses finally placed 2 tiny boys in her arms, first Leo, then Finn, everything else faded away. They were perfect, identical, and yet already with subtle differences in the way their lips curled and their fingers curled. She held them both to her chest and whispered, "You're safe now. We'll be okay." The nurses asked about the father for the birth certificate. She left the space blank, stayed in the hospital for 4 days, then brought the boys home wrapped in mismatched blankets. The cottage was colder now, but she didn't mind. She swaddled them tightly, laid them side by side in the cot, and sat near them every night, just watching their tiny chests rise and fall. Exhaustion crept in like a wave, but she rode it with a strength she never knew she possessed. She fed them every 3 hours, rocked them through colic cries. She changed nappies by flashlight when the power flickered during a storm. She didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch, but somehow found beauty in the chaos. Weeks turned into months. The town slowly became home. She started taking the boys for walks on the beach in the mornings, bundled in a double pram, their blue eyes watching the sky in wonder. Neighbors grew accustomed to her, some offering small kindnesses like warm soup or used toys. A woman at the grocery store taught her how to coupon. An old man in the park taught Leo how to throw a pine cone like a ball. These small kindnesses built a world around her, a new kind of family. She never mentioned Alexander to anyone. When people asked, she simply said the boy's father wasn't around, then changed the subject. She kept her surname, treasured the photos of their first smiles, and though the ache of what she'd lost still visited her on the quietest nights, she didn't regret leaving, because here, in this quiet place, filled with sand, wind, and two small boys who now called her Mummy, with sticky fingers and sleepy giggles, she had found something Alexander Thorne would never understand. She had found peace. 4 years passed like a tide, slow but constant, silently reshaping Evelyn's world. What had once been raw pain gradually softened into something more complex, a bittersweet blend of strength, exhaustion, and resilience. The small cottage that once felt like a hiding place had become a true home. The cracks in the walls no longer bothered her. The floors still creaked underfoot, but the sound had become familiar, even comforting. Most mornings started before the sun rose, when 2 pairs of small feet would thunder down the hallway and climb into her bed, burrowing under the covers with cold toes and tangled hair. Leo and Finn, now 5 years old, had grown into insightful, curious little boys. They were inseparable. They talked constantly over each other, constantly trying to outwit her, and always asking questions about everything, from why the ocean moved to why she always smiled when they said, "I love you." They were beautiful, and the resemblance to Alexander only grew stronger with time. Sometimes it startled her, his piercing blue eyes, his defiant little chin, the way they tilted their heads when they didn't understand something. There were days it was hard to separate his memory from their own presence, but they weren't him. They were hers. They had been shaped by her values, her love, her patience, and humor. They knew nothing of betrayal or disappointment. She had made sure of that. Evelyn worked part-time at a local bookshop now, where the owner allowed her to bring the boys after preschool on quiet afternoons. They'd sit in the children's section while she restocked shelves or helped a customer find an obscure title. The town had embraced them. The librarian knew their names. The barista at the coffee shop knew she preferred decaf with oat milk. She had built a quiet, small life, filled with routines that brought her solace. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and it was hers. Still, there were moments the past would come creeping back. An online headline, a passing conversation, an old memory triggered by a scent or the feel of expensive fabric. She didn't allow herself to Google Alexander, though the temptation had been there more than once. She didn't want to know what he'd become, if he'd remarried, if he had other children. She told herself it no longer mattered, but deep down, a tiny sliver of pain still lived inside her. Not because she missed him, but because he hadn't even looked for them. He had let her go pregnant with his children, and never once tried to find out where they had gone. Then the invitation arrived. She found it in her mailbox one afternoon, sand still clinging to her sandals from a beach walk, a thick envelope with a gold seal and her full name printed in calligraphy. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity and instinct battled her caution. Inside was an invitation to a high-profile charity gala, an annual event she had attended before, long ago, when she still lived in London, Alexander Thorne's wife. She almost laughed. Was it a mistake? A cruel joke? Or worse, a test? It didn't say who had sent it, but she knew. Her fingers trembled as she held it. She hadn't seen his name or his face in years, and yet every cell in her body remembered the way he spoke, the way he stood. the exact tone of his voice when he'd uttered the words that made her leave. "Pregnant? I don't need you." She could still hear it, as if it had just happened. And now, after 4 years of silence, an invitation? She wanted to rip it up, shred it, and pretend it had never arrived on her doorstep. But something inside her stopped her. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or perhaps it was for her sons. Leo and Finn had never known their father, didn't even know he existed. And a part of her, the part that ached on their birthdays, when she filled both parental roles alone, wondered if they deserved at least a truth. She didn't RSVP immediately. She left it on the kitchen counter for 5 days. She looked at it every morning as she poured cereal, every evening as she packed school lunches. On the 6th day, she made a decision. If Alexander Thorne wanted to see her again, then he would. But it wouldn't be the version of her he once knew. He wouldn't find the young, vulnerable, trusting woman who brought him lunch and news of his twins. He would see the mother, the protector, the woman who had built a life from nothing and turned heartbreak into strength. And she wouldn't come alone. She bought matching black suits for the boys, tiny ones with satin lapels. She chose a soft cream-colored gown, one that made her feel powerful and elegant. She braided her hair the way she used to before she lost herself. And on the night of the gala, she walked into the ballroom with her chin held high, her sons on either side of her, holding each of her hands. It was time. The ballroom shimmered under soft crystal light, the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter filling the air. Wealth floated through the room like perfume. Tailored tuxedos, designer gowns, whispered conversations about investments and philanthropy. Alexander Thorne stood near the center, surrounded by admirers, business partners, and acquaintances, all of whom saw him as the untouchable golden boy. His black suit was impeccable, his hair perfectly coiffed, and his cold blue eyes scanned the room with the practiced detachment of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He was there more out of obligation than desire. These events had long since lost their thrill for him. The drinks all tasted the same, the compliments blurred together, and the people requesting photos were no longer interested in him as a person, only in what he represented. Once, that thought flattered him. Now, it just left him tired. He was answering another question about a recent acquisition when something shifted in the atmosphere. A silence, almost imperceptible, spread among the nearby guests. Heads turned, his assistant paused mid-sentence. Alexander followed their gaze instinctively, his brows raised slightly with polite curiosity, until his eyes met hers. Evelyn walked into the ballroom slowly but deliberately, her figure graceful and poised in a soft cream gown that made her look like she'd stepped out of a dream. Her long blonde hair was pulled back in a loose braid, her expression unreadable, but it was her eyes that stopped him dead. They weren't angry. They weren't soft. They were steady, focused, confident. And then he saw them. 2 small boys in matching tiny black suits held her hands on either side. They looked about 5 years old. Their hair was dark, thick, and neatly combed, their cheeks flushed with the excitement of being in a new, glamorous place. But what truly disarmed Alexander inside were their eyes, mirrored reflections of his own. That impossible shade of icy blue that no one in his family, except him, had ever had. The noise around him faded to silence. Evelyn's gaze flickered to him for the briefest fraction of a second, acknowledging his presence with nothing more than a glance, before she shifted her attention to her sons, kneeling to straighten a jacket button and whisper something that made them both smile. Alexander couldn't move. He couldn't think. Everything inside him had gone utterly still. His mind scrambled for logic. How? Was it possible? Could she have? No. He would have known. She would have told him. But then again, she hadn't said a word when she left. He had watched her walk away without even a sentence. He assumed she was angry. Perhaps she wanted space. He had told himself she'd overreacted, that she'd be back. But she never was. And he had let her go, believing it was her decision, never once wondering why she would disappear so completely. Now, looking at the boys, he knew exactly why. He wanted to move closer. Every instinct in him screamed to move, but his feet remained rooted to the marble floor as Evelyn took a few more steps into the room, heads turning to follow her silent procession. She didn't look uncomfortable. She didn't look unsure. If anything, she looked like she belonged more than he ever had. Guests whispered. Murmurs spread through the crowd, looking between her and him. The resemblance was undeniable. One of the boys, Leo, though Alexander didn't know it yet, looked at him. Their eyes met, and Leo tilted his head, studying him with curiosity. Then came the question that shattered any self-control Alexander had managed to maintain. "Mummy, is that the man from your picture box?" Evelyn's lips parted slightly. She looked at her son, then at Alexander. And finally, she walked towards him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was silent, dignified. The weight of it crushed the air around them, more than any shouted accusation ever could have. She stopped a few feet away, the boys standing close, their small hands still clutching hers. Alexander felt his heart pound like it hadn't in years. "These are your sons," she said simply, her voice quiet, her expression unreadable. He stared at them, at her. His mind screamed with 1,000 questions, but his mouth could only utter one word. "Sons?" Evelyn nodded slightly. He looked at them again, closer now. The shape of their noses, the arch of their brows, their stance. It was undeniable. For a man so obsessed with control, with certainty, Alexander felt something inside him crumble. It wasn't just shock. It was regret. A crushing, suffocating regret. "I didn't know," he said, the words barely a whisper. "You never told me." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, not with accusation, but with a quiet acceptance of the irony. "I didn't think you'd care." That sentence landed like a knife. He felt it cut deeper than any business failure or public scandal. He wanted to protest, to explain, to tell her he would have cared, that he could have been different. But he knew she wouldn't believe him, and perhaps she shouldn't. A quick glance around showed that the room was buzzing. The children looked between them both, sensing something, but not understanding. Evelyn knelt beside them again and smiled. "Why don't you two go find some juice? I saw some near the dessert table." They nodded, still curious about the strange man who had made Mummy quiet, but trusting her enough to scamper off. Now they were alone. Alexander looked at her again. Truly looked at her. She wasn't the woman he remembered. She was stronger, more grounded, more resilient. And he wasn't the man she once loved. "Why now?" he asked softly. She exhaled. "I didn't come for you," she said honestly. "I came to show them I'm not afraid of you anymore." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding in that moment something he hadn't been ready to understand before. She didn't need anything from him. But perhaps, for the first time in his life, he needed something from her. "What do you think Alexander will do next? Will he truly change?" Comment below. Alexander didn't sleep that night. After the gala ended and the guests departed, their murmurs still echoing in his ears. He remained in the empty ballroom long after the lights dimmed. The image of Evelyn's face, steady and confident, and the two boys in miniature tuxedos, his sons, haunted him with relentless clarity. He had faced mergers, lawsuits, and public scrutiny, but nothing had shaken him as profoundly as the silent truth in her eyes. She hadn't returned angry, hadn't returned begging. She had returned whole, self-sufficient, with living proof of the family he had discarded. Back in his penthouse, the silence screamed at him. He walked from room to room, suddenly aware of how empty everything was. No toys on the floor, no tiny socks in the laundry, no drawings on the fridge. He sat on the edge of his bed, still in his suit, and replayed every moment from 4 years ago. Her standing in the doorway, the expression on her face, the lunchbox in her hand, her silence, his arrogance, the women laughing beside him. He had dismissed her without a word, assuming she would come back, because in his world, people always did. But she hadn't, and he had never pursued her. Not until now did he realize how much that had cost him. The next day, Alexander did what he never thought he would. He made contact. A mutual acquaintance had greeted Evelyn at the event and mentioned she lived in Cornwall. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He didn't send lawyers, didn't send a formal request. He sent a letter, handwritten, not typed. No corporate letterhead, no company seal. He told her he understood if she never wanted to see him again, but that he would give anything for the chance to meet his sons. He demanded nothing. He didn't mention custody or rights. He simply asked if she would meet him for coffee. Just once. No lawyers, no pressure. Evelyn didn't reply for 2 weeks. When she finally did, it came in the form of a short email. An hour, a place, a small coffee shop by the water in her town. No greeting, no emotion, just clear boundaries. But she agreed to meet. Alexander flew down the next morning and arrived hours early. He sat in the coffee shop with 2 coffees, checking the door every 5 seconds, unsure what he would say. When Evelyn walked in, she looked tired, but still stunning. Her hair pulled back, sunglasses tucked into her collar, a coat wrapped around her like armor. She didn't sit immediately. She just looked at him and said, "You have 10 minutes." He nodded, already knowing he deserved no more. He started by apologizing. Not with dramatic words, but with simple, direct ones. He told her he had been blind, selfish, and cruel, that he had failed to recognize what mattered until it was too late, that he wasn't asking for her forgiveness, but for the chance to do better now. For their sons, if not for her. Evelyn listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't soften. But she didn't leave either. When his 10 minutes were up, she sat across from him. "I've raised them without you," she said. "They're healthy, smart, and happy. I don't need anything from you. But they might." Alexander looked up, cautiously hopeful. "I don't want to confuse them," she continued. "They know their story in a simplified way. But if I let you in, even a little, you need to understand. This has to be on their terms. You can't just come and go. If you come in, you stay." He swallowed. He nodded once and said, "I'm ready." She watched him a moment longer and then pulled something from her bag. 2 crayon drawings folded in half. "They made these after the gala. This one's Leo's and this one's Finn's. They don't know who you are, but they both drew you." His hands trembled as he opened the papers. One showed a tall man in a black suit, with a small child in each of his hands. The other was simpler. Just a large blue eye and a smiling face labeled, "The man from the party." Alexander couldn't speak. He just stared. "You can meet them," Evelyn said quietly. "But not as their father. Not yet. As someone new. A friend. They'll ask questions, and I'll answer them when they're ready." He nodded again, overwhelmed with emotion. "Thank you." Evelyn stood. "Don't thank me. Show them." And with that, she left, leaving the drawings in his hands. Alexander remained in the coffee shop long after she was gone. The weight of those small papers anchored him more than any deal or dollar he had ever held. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't know if he was capable of becoming the man they needed. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to try. Not for pride, not for redemption, but for two boys who had drawn him into their world before he had even earned a place in it. The first meeting happened in a small park near Evelyn's cottage, under the golden leaves of early autumn. Alexander arrived early, dressed in simple clothes for the first time in years. Dark jeans, a navy sweater, and worn trainers he'd had to dig out from the back of his wardrobe. It felt strange without his usual armor of tailored suits and coats. But Evelyn had asked him to dress casually, not to overwhelm the boys. He waited near the playground, hands tucked into his pockets, trying to ignore the pounding of his heart as children played and parents chatted nearby. When he finally saw them, it felt as though something in the world had stopped. Just for a second. Evelyn walked slowly down the gravel path, holding each boy's hand. The twins wore matching jackets, their cheeks rosy from the breeze, their dark hair ruffled by the wind. They looked around with a child's natural curiosity, unaware that their entire world was about to shift. Evelyn gave Alexander a small nod, but didn't smile. She knelt beside the boys and whispered something, gesturing towards him. Then she stood and said clearly, "Leo, Finn, this is Alexander. He's someone I used to know. He wanted to meet you." The boys looked at him with interest, but no fear. Leo, always the more direct of the two, walked up first and said, "Do you like dinosaurs?" Alexander blinked, surprised. Then he smiled genuinely. "I love them, especially the Stegosaurus." Leo grinned. "That's the best one. It has spikes on its back." Finn joined them a second later and added, "I like the T-Rex. He's the boss." Alexander crouched to their height. "I bet you're both experts." That was all it took. Within minutes, the twins were showing him their favorite part of the playground, climbing onto the wooden ship structure and inviting him to be the captain. Evelyn stood nearby, watching intently, her arms crossed, but not out of anger, but more like a silent defense. She wasn't protecting herself anymore. She was protecting them. But she didn't interfere. She let the scene unfold. And, to her surprise, Alexander didn't act like their father. He didn't force closeness. He simply followed their lead, listening, laughing when they joked, and answering every question they asked. Over the next few weeks, these meetings became a regular rhythm. Always in public, always with Evelyn present. They went to the zoo, to a puppet show at the library, to the beach where the boys built castles, and Alexander helped them collect shells. He never asked for more time. He never demanded to see them alone. And because of that, the boys began to open up to him naturally. They started saving stories to tell him, running to him when they saw him, shouting, "Alexander!" with genuine excitement. Evelyn was surprised at how easily they accepted him, and she was even more surprised at how different he was. He didn't bring expensive gifts or make grand gestures. Instead, he showed up on time. He remembered the boys' favorite snacks, asked how their week at school had been, and listened patiently to every long, winding story they told. One day, Leo fell. While running and scraped his knee, it was Alexander who picked him up, comforted him, and sang a silly little song until the tears subsided. Evelyn had to turn away, swallowing an emotion she didn't expect. Still, she kept her guard up. One consistent month didn't erase 4 years of silence, but she couldn't deny the change in him. He was no longer the man who had dismissed her with a careless phrase. He was quieter now, more intentional, and even uncertain at times. That vulnerability, once so alien to Alexander, was what made her start to believe this might not just be temporary. One late October afternoon, they lingered at the park longer than usual. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the trees, and the boys were drawing in the dirt with sticks. Evelyn and Alexander sat on the bench, a few feet apart, watching them. "Thank you," Alexander said, his voice low, "for letting me be here." Evelyn looked at him, but didn't reply immediately. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was contemplative. "You're doing better than I thought," she admitted. "You haven't left." "I've wanted to," he said, a slight smile. "This is harder than anything I've ever done. It's the first time I've been truly afraid to fail." Evelyn looked back at the boys. "They don't need perfection. They need presence." Alexander nodded, taking those words to heart like a promise. "I want to be that. Not for me. For them. And for you. If you'll let me." She didn't answer immediately, but her expression softened enough to give him hope. That night, after they'd said goodbye, and the boys had hugged him fiercely without any prompting, Evelyn stood by his car and said quietly, "Next time, you can come home." Alexander felt something inside him open up. Relief, gratitude, and the sense that perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't about forgiveness anymore. Perhaps it was about building something new, one small moment at a time. The first time Alexander stepped into Evelyn's cottage, he felt like he was entering a life he was never meant to see, but had unknowingly yearned for. It was small and warm, with faded wallpaper and old wooden floors that creaked with every step. But every inch of the space spoke of love and memories. Crayon drawings were taped to the fridge in uneven lines. Small shoes were scattered near the door, and the faint scent of something sweet, perhaps vanilla or cinnamon, drifted in the air. Leo and Finn ran ahead of him, shedding their jackets and tearing into the living room, where a half-collapsed blanket fort covered a pile of books. Alexander stood awkwardly in the hallway, unsure whether to follow them or wait for permission like a guest. Evelyn walked past him, her arm brushing gently against his as she headed to the kitchen. And for some reason, that quiet gesture steadied him more than anything she could have said. He spent the afternoon with the boys on the living room floor, building Lego towers and pretending to be a monster as they shrieked with laughter. At one point, Evelyn walked in with a tray of snacks and stood watching them in silence. Alexander met her gaze and saw something that hadn't been there before. Not trust, not yet, but something closer to peace. She didn't speak, simply sat nearby and let the scene unfold. Over the following weeks, the visits to the cottage became more frequent. They were still cautious, but less formal. Alexander helped make pancakes on Saturday mornings, always burning at least one, to the boys' delight. He read bedtime stories, his voice, awkward at first, then slowly warming, as the twins demanded voices for every character. He stayed to fix a dripping tap one day, then returned the next to replace a broken step on the porch. Evelyn didn't ask him to do any of it, and he never acted as though it earned him anything, but each gesture became a silent offering. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, curled in blankets on the sofa, Evelyn and Alexander sat outside on the back steps, wrapped in coats, sipping tea. The stars above the trees were unusually bright, and the night air carried the faint sound of ocean waves in the distance. "I never expected this," she said softly. Alexander looked at her, unsure if she meant the life she had built, his reappearance in it, or something else entirely. "Me neither," he admitted. "I thought I could bury everything I did, move on as if it never happened. But it stayed with me. You stayed with me." Evelyn didn't reply immediately. She was looking at the stars, her profile outlined by the faint moonlight. "They might ask about you again," she finally said. Leo wanted to know if you used to live in a castle. Alexander chuckled softly. I suppose my old place might have seemed like one to them. Evelyn smiled faintly, but didn't turn to him. I told them the truth, that we were once together, that things didn't work out as I hoped, that people make mistakes, and some try to fix them. He felt something twist inside him. Shame, yes, but also humility. Did they understand? They're kids. They understand more than we give them credit for. They sat in silence for a while longer before Alexander said quietly, Do you think there's any part of you that could ever believe in me again? Not because of the past, but because of who I'm trying to become. Evelyn turned to him then, not with anger, not with the bitterness he feared, but with honesty. I don't know yet, but I think the boys see something in you, and that's a good place to start. He nodded, accepting that. He didn't push, didn't ask for more. A week later, a storm hit the town hard. The power went out at night, and branches lashed against the windows. Evelyn had candles lit, blankets piled high, and was reading a book to the twins by flashlight, when Alexander knocked on the door, soaked from the rain, holding a bag of batteries and hot soup. You shouldn't have driven in this, Evelyn said as she let him in. I didn't want you to be alone in the dark, he replied. That night, after the boys were asleep in sleeping bags near the fireplace, Alexander and Evelyn sat together, watching the flames. She leaned her head lightly on his shoulder. It wasn't a promise, not a declaration, but a moment of true closeness. Earned, not taken. And for the first time, Alexander didn't feel like a man trying to reclaim something he had lost. He felt like a father, like a man finally stepping into the role he should never have abandoned. And by his side was the woman who had every reason to hate him, but who instead chose to see who he was becoming. The twins' 5th birthday arrived on a crisp spring morning, the kind of day that felt perfectly made for new beginnings. The air smelled of blossoms and earth, and sunlight filtered through the trees that surrounded the small cottage Evelyn had once chosen as a safe place to disappear. Now it felt less like a hiding place, and more like a heart that had slowly, patiently reopened. Balloons were tied to the porch railing, and the backyard had been transformed into an impromptu celebration space, with picnic tables, colorful streamers, and 2 homemade cakes. One shaped like a dinosaur, and the other a spaceship, just as Leo and Finn had requested. Alexander had arrived early to help set up. He wore jeans and a gray t-shirt, smudged with frosting and grass, sleeves rolled up, his hands sticky with tape and ribbons. He moved with the easy rhythm of someone who had learned to stop proving and start participating. He let the twins boss him around, change the plan every 5 minutes, and when they begged him to wear a paper crown, he did so without protest. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window as he helped hang a banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Explorers," and felt a mix of pride, warmth, and a quiet disbelief that the man outside was the same one she had once walked away from without a word. Guests began to arrive. Friends from nursery, kind neighbors, the woman from the bookshop, the old man from the park. The yard filled with laughter and the sound of running feet. Leo and Finn moved through the crowd in superhero capes, their cheeks flushed with joy, pausing occasionally to show off their presents or shout instructions to anyone willing to follow the rules of their mission. Alexander played every game they invented, crawled through cardboard tunnels, pretended to be zapped by invisible lasers. Evelyn poured punch and unanswered questions, and replenished bowls of crisps. But each time she saw Alexander hoist one of the boys onto his shoulders or gently tie their shoelaces, her heart squeezed with something she couldn't name. As the sun began to set, and the children gathered for cake, Evelyn lit the candles slowly. One for each year They had made it through together. Alexander stood just behind the boys, his hands gently on their shoulders. As everyone sang happy birthday, Evelyn watched as the twins closed their eyes, made silent wishes, and blew out the flames in unison. The applause and cheers that followed were almost loud enough to drown out the break in her voice as she whispered, "We made it." Later that night, after the guests had left, and the backyard was a quiet mess of paper plates and popped balloons, the four of them sat on a quilt under the stars. Leo and Finn were sleepy and sugar-filled, nestled against each of their parents, their capes still tied around their necks, their eyes heavy but resisting sleep, as children do when everything feels too magical to end. Alexander had one arm protectively around both boys, and his other hand reached across the space between them to find Evelyn's. She didn't pull away, instead lacing her fingers with his, and in that small gesture, something shifted permanently. No grand speech, no declaration, just a hand finding its way home. They sat there in silence for a while, until Finn mumbled, "Are you staying tonight, Alexander?" Evelyn opened her mouth to reply, but Alexander spoke first, his voice soft and sure. "If your mummy agrees, I'd love to." Leo turned his head, blinking up at Evelyn. "Can he? Please." She looked at them, then at Alexander, and this time, when she smiled, it wasn't cautious, it wasn't reserved. It was full and real. "Yes," she said simply, "he can." The boys cheered faintly, before drifting off to sleep, their heads resting on shoulders that had finally learned to carry them. That night, Alexander tucked them in and stayed up late with Evelyn, the two of them sitting on the porch, long after the candles were out and the cake was put away. They talked in low voices, honestly, about everything that had passed and everything that might yet come. No promises, no pressure, just the truth. In the quiet hours of the early morning, Alexander looked out at the backyard, now empty, but still shimmering with the memory of laughter and whispers. "I never thought I'd get to be a part of this." Evelyn looked at him and said, "You didn't just show up, Alex. You earned your place." And in that moment, with the moonlight casting silver shadows and the soft rhythm of his children's breathing echoing through the house, they both knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Thank you for reading. We hope this story resonated with you. If it did, please give it a thumbs up, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives. Your comments and feedback are always welcome.